2 days ago on Twitter, I promised everybody I'm gonna record a video on how to migrate from Next.js to React Router. After migrating, I realized that the migration from Next.js to React Router is almost identical to the migration from Next.js to TanStack Start. So this video is gonna act as a guide for both, and I'm gonna explain as we go what the subtle differences are, but the migration itself is pretty familiar. It's a matter of convention. So instead of writing an Next.js app from scratch myself and then migrating it over, that would have been way too much work. I've used a template from another YouTuber called orgdev, and I'm gonna link the repository down below so you can check it out and you can follow along as you see what the migration from his Next.js project to the actual React Router project looks like. And before we actually do that, I'm gonna show you the end product and what the app looks like. So this is the actual app, and it's NodeForge. And if you're a member of the React Router community, you've probably heard of Kenzie Dodd's Epic Stack. And this is actually very similar because it's basically a note-taking app, and you can go to your dashboard, take notes, you can log in, you can log out, and stuff like that. And the funny thing is, because my company is called Forge42, by coincidence, orgdev called this NodeForge, so this was the perfect template to move over. And what you are looking at is the actual final React Router migration product, and this is running on React Router. So if I actually go to login, I can do stuff like lmforge42.dev, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I log in. And now Chrome warns me about my passwords. I don't care about that. You can see that I have notes. I can edit them. Whoops, this was broken because I broke something while I was migrating. And then you can use this fancy editor to actually write your notes. And it's actually a rich text editor with TipTap. So this is a pretty complex note-taking app, and I migrated this over in just about 4 hours from Next.js to React Router. So it's not a time-consuming process, and the app itself is pretty cool and feature-heavy, and it uses better-auth as well, and all that cool stuff, so yeah. Alright, so how did I do it? So before we dive in, I just want to show you the reference repository I created. So it's under the Forge42 organization. I'm gonna link it in the comments. It's called NodeForge React Router because this is migrated into React Router. And basically this is the end product of what I just showed you, the app from right before. And you also have this link that takes you to the actual Next.js repository. And what I've done here is after I've finished migration, I've created commits to basically take you one step at a time of what you need to do. And this is the initial commit that's the Next.js project, so the reference repository. And all of these commits basically show you how to migrate step by step. So for example, you have the create a React Router app running on dev, and you go from there. So that is what we are going to go through, and I'm going to explain step by step what I did. So this guide here from TanStack Start is actually perfect because this actually works for both React Router and TanStack Start for 80% of the actual migration. The only difference is if you're going with TanStack Start, where if you're not going to export loaders, you're going to use their handlers. If you're going with React Router, you're going to use loaders. So it's very, very similar because TanStack Start and React Router Framework Mode are very similar in their approaches. So it's very easy to migrate from one to the other and to actually migrate an Next.js app to one or the other. So it's kind of cool that all of the cool frameworks are very similar to one another and have similar approaches. So it's really easy to migrate between them, but yeah. So just an FYI, whatever you're migrating to is gonna be easy. So we're gonna skip the prerequisites parts because this is not required from our side, and we're gonna go to remove Next.js. So I wouldn't recommend actually starting with this because if you remove Next.js from your application, you'll have a dead application until the point of actually getting everything up and running and migrated. If you have a very small project, this maybe makes sense for you, But if you have a larger project, I would highly recommend to create a different folder and put your start app there and then migrate gradually into it. And then when you're done, then you delete all the next references and remove it completely from the project. And that's actually what I did here. And if I open this first commit, the first thing I did was I went, added the git ignore for the React router stuff, and I converted the project to be of type module. So this uses ESM modules instead of CJS. And for some reason, Next.js uses CJS by default, even though it's like 2025, but whatever. And instead of removing it completely, what I did was I created dev vite, and this actually runs a dev server with vite. So that is how we get up a dev server running, and it uses vite. So this step is required by both TanStack Start and React Router. And then I've added packages that I need. So Unpick React is the open source friendly alternative to Next image. Isbot is added by React Router that we need. We added React Router. We added Tailwind Vite because we need that for the Vite dev server to get Tailwind up and running. And then I've added unplugin fonts. That's for adding fonts. I'm gonna show you that later on. And then we also add vite and vite plugin tsconfig pads. So the first part is just getting a vite server up and running. And I've also added the vite config. And here I've already plugged in and prepared everything I need. So I've plugged in the unfonts plugin. This allows us to load custom fonts in. I've added Tailwind. This allows you to run Tailwind. I've added pads. This allows you to do like, instead of doing / something, you can do something like @/source or something like that. So this is what this plugin is for. And then React Router. So the only difference between TanStack Start and React Router is the plugin here. So if you're using Start, you're gonna go with Start. If you're using React Router, you're gonna go with React Router. So you plug this in here, and all the other plugins are the same, so you don't really have to worry about that part. So that is your first part. All right, so if you're doing TanStack Start, you're gonna install these dependencies. These are the dev dependencies you need. So as you can see, they also use the tsconfig pads, they use Tailwind, Tailwind Vite. So it's very similar, as you can see. And after you're done with the dependency and starting up Vite, as you can see here, you add the scripts. So I would recommend, until you're fully migrated, just to have them run like dev Vite or dev React Router or whatever, until you're done with the migration. And the actual start here is going to be very similar between the two. Instead of running this command for React Router, you're gonna run node build server index.js. That's the only difference between the two. And as I said, you can see if I compare this to our vite config that I did for React Router, it's almost identical. All right, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the root. So the root has a few steps in it. So if we go back here and I go to root, let's talk about what we do. So for example, this application uses Nux, and Nux has adapters. And originally, if I go to this reference repository and if I go to app and I go open up the main layout, you can see here that first of all, Nux uses the Next app adapter. And in our example, we just switch it to React Router version 7. And that's how we migrate Nux. And if you use custom fonts like this, so you're using the Geist font from Vercel, you have multiple options. The first option that I went for is this repository. It's called unplugin fonts. And how it works is you basically add it as a vite plugin. And what you do is you just add the font in your project. So if I go back to here, if I go back to the commits, you can see that I added the fonts in sources style fonts. And these are all the fonts. And then you can basically just import the CSS as a side effect. If I go to their docs here and I scroll down, you just import it in the root TSX file, and that's how you get the Geist font up and running. That's your first option. The second option is to follow the TanStack Start recommendations, and if you go here to the fonts section, you can see that instead of doing this, what you can do is you can also install the fonts like this and then add them in Tailwind. So this is also similar to what I did. It's just a little bit of a different approach, so it's really up to you what you want to do. And if we look at the Tailwind CSS file, I also include the Geist font here and then override the Sans font to use Geist. So that's how you get Geist going on in your project. And that's how to migrate fonts. So that's the first part of the root TSX. The second part is adding the adapters. So thankfully, the Next Theme adapter actually works in other frameworks, even though it's called Next Themes. So you're good to go with that. Toasters and all the other React specific wrappers are usable across any framework, so you don't have to worry about that. And all you have to do is export a layout, and then in the layout wrap your children with the providers. So that's pretty simple, and this is the same across TanStack Start and Router. The only difference is in TanStack Start, you are going to follow this. So adapting the root layout, so you just move the metadata inside of here. So this is very similar to React Router, where you just change it to be the same structure as here, but just an export called meta instead of having it in the create root route. And then your layout, instead of exporting a layout in React Router, you would just add the component here. So as you can see, you don't export a default one. In React Router you do. So those are the very, very small differences between the two. So depending on what you want to migrate to, that's how you do it. And then finally, for environment variable handling, what I opted in to do is I moved everything to the server, and then I pass it from the server to the client via loader. And then inside of the default export for the root, what I do is I inject the window environment with the client environment from the server, and then I declare it as the return type of the loader. So what this does is it allows you to do window.environment, and we're going to see how I use it later on. And this is important if you have anything on the client that needs an environment variable coming from process.environment, because process environment is actually not available in the browser, but in Next.js it acts like it is. So that's why you need to migrate to some other process environment handling. You can also use vite's built-in one. It's really up to you, but that's just something to know. So the next few steps are pretty easy. The first one is moving the favicon. So basically you move it from the app router into public/favicon, and you're done with that. And then this is the fun part. So what you need to do next is move from next/link and next/router and next/whatever to the equivalent of the framework you're moving to. So if you're replacing the link and you're following this guide, you can scroll to the link section, and basically this is what you do. And fun fact, if you're moving to React Router, you just remove this part, so the TanStack prefix, and it's identical. So you just need to replace the href with 2, and you need to change the import. And when you do that across the whole project, like I did here, so for example, here I remove the next link, I add the React Router one, and same here, I add the link and change the href to 2. And you can also use the type safe href function from React Router to actually make this type safe if you want. And the next thing you need to do is replace next image. So next image has an open source alternative that's not belonging to Next, and that's unpick. So if you go to unpick, they have actually an image component that's framework agnostic and works across all frameworks. And the package is called unpick image. So you can just follow this guide on how to use it, but from my experience, it's literally a drop-in replacement. The only thing you need to do is change the import to be this. And as you can see in the diff, I literally just replaced the image and that's it. So the only difference in the props is that sometimes when you're using image, it doesn't take the width and the height as a string, it takes it as a number. So that's the only difference you need to worry about. It's a drop-in replacement. It works great with React Router, with TanStack Start, with whatever you want. And now you're getting to a point where you're very close to moving away from Next. And this is actually the point where you want to start migrating your routes. So I'm going to show you how I migrate the authentication flow, and I'm going to talk about how you can incrementally migrate from Next to React Router or TanStack Start. And the way you do that is, for example, if you have server actions, and if I look at the old implementation, for example, in TanStack Start, what you can do is you can create server functions instead of server actions. And this is how you do it. So instead of using the useRouter, you import the create server function and then you replace the server function. In React Router, this acts a little bit differently where you don't need to do any changes to the actual server functions, but you need to change the way you use them. So depending on what framework you're migrating to, you have two options. If it's to React Router, this doesn't require any changes, but it requires changes in the components themselves, where you would need to use either a fetcher or a submit function to send it to an appropriate loader or an action. Or if you're migrating to TanStack Start, what you're gonna need to do is change all of these server actions to use server functions from TanStack and basically change them to do this. So that's the two approaches depending on what you're doing. Because I migrated this to React Router, what I did, I changed this to be notebooks.server.ts. So if we're using it on the client, our server is gonna throw and complain and crash, because it's very easy to discover where you're actually using server functions, server actions if you do this. And if you check out the files, they're identical to what they used to be before. I just changed the names. And now we need to change the components. So the components themselves need to do a few things. If you're using the useRouter, it needs to change, and this is either gonna be useNavigate or nothing. And what I mean by that is, for example, here, when you do router.push, you need to change that to navigate to another page. So in React Router, that's gonna be useNavigate and then navigate to somewhere. And in TanStack Start, that's going to be their own hook. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this is where what I just spoke about changing the components comes into play. So in React Router, we don't have server functions, or we don't have server actions as well. At least at the time of making of this video, they're working on RSCs in framework mode, so this might not be relevant by the time you're migrating. So what you need to do is, instead of calling the server action here directly, you need to use something like a fetcher or submit to the current route in an action and then handle it there. And if I go to the source/routes and if I open the login page, for example, you have this action that actually now handles the form submission and processes the data and signs the user in, opposed to what was happening in the login form when we directly call this action. So that's the difference. And you can do this route by route, and that's the way I recommend to do it, because it's incremental and you don't have to move like 50 routes in one day. You can move one by one. And that's why I don't recommend removing Next.js completely from the get-go. And at the point where you're happy with it, you just completely remove it. And for example, in this scenario, I migrated the homepage, the API for the better-auth, and the routes for login and stuff. And another thing you need to do is you need to change how you handle better-auth and your authentication provider. Now, I can't really help you with that part. It really depends on what you're using. For example, this project used better-auth, and what I did was I just went to their documentation. I did what it said, so basically added this in as a catch-all route. And then in the auth, I removed the next cookies plugin, and all of this other stuff is pretty much the same, so I didn't have to do anything here. And in the auth client, I do this. So this is where the poly environment comes into play, where I was talking about earlier. Because this runs on the server and on the client, we check what the type of window is. If it's defined, it means we're on the client, so we use the window environment, otherwise we use the process environment. And that's how we get the auth client to work in both scenarios. You can also use the auth client only on the client, that's up to you, but that's just something I wanted to show you on how you can easily replace the process environment from Next.js and move it to like a poly environment where it works during server-side rendering. And the final thing I did was really important because, and I think this is gonna be the same with TanStack Start as it is with React Router, because better-auth uses cookies to store the info. I return the sign-in user as a response, and then I return that from my loader. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna store the cookie in your browser, and that's gonna allow the authentication to work. Where in Next.js, what they do is magically behind the scenes store these cookies for you. You have to do this manually in TanStack Start and React Router because they don't like magic and abstracting crucial things away from you. So that's something to keep in mind here. And that's how you migrate authentication. And again, now that you have all of this up and running, you're on your way to the next step, and that's moving away more routes. So this is what I did here. So for example, I had these components that had server actions. I moved them out of the components. So for example, here, I moved it to a fetcher. Inside of this one, I also moved it to a fetcher. And this one as well, this one, rich text editor. So I'm just gradually going route by route and moving all the server actions outside of the components. And the cool thing is RSA support is coming, so maybe you don't even have to do this as well. And as you can see in the diff here, what I did was I just replaced these components with the actual React Router approach. In TanStack Start, you're just gonna use the server functions, so you don't really have to do this part. And I'm just adding the dashboard component and the dashboard layout. I add the middleware that's used. So basically, for example, here, we check if the user is logged in. If he's not, we throw him to the login page so he can't access the dashboard. And then we have our resource routes where we actually delete nodes, update nodes, create notebooks and stuff like that. So this is pretty much React Router stuff, but if you're moving to TanStack Start, you can probably skip this part. And once you've migrated all the routes, this is the final thing you need to do. So remove all references of Next. And the way you do that, you kill the .next folder, you remove the app directory. So you can see I removed all the routes. And here I accidentally added these in, so you're not adding in anything into the app router. And then you just basically remove everything. So you killed the app router, you've successfully migrated off of it. You kill all the routes, and then basically you remove references from ESLint, you remove middleware that's used by Next like this, you remove the Next config, you remove it from the package JSON, and then instead of having two scripts, you just merge back into whatever you're using. So either React Router or TanStack Start. And if you look at the other ones, all the other commits are basically me just adding README updates, and I actually removed. So another thing you can do is you can have a temporary repository that hosts the other project. For example, I put it in /source, and when I removed the app directory, I just renamed it to app. So that's something you can do as well. TLDR of it, if you're moving from Next.js to TanStack Start, you should follow this guide. I'm going to update it in a little bit to include like Next.js image and some other tips and pointers you can do. And that should have you covered to migrate from Next.js to TanStack Router. And if you're migrating from Next.js to React Router, you can use my reference repository. I'm going to link it down below. You can ask me questions as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You can check out the code here. If you need any help, let me know. And I hope you're looking forward to moving to one of the two best React frameworks out there. I think that react-router and TanStack Start are the best in class, so whatever you move to, you're not gonna make a mistake. They're very similar in their approaches, and the differences are very minimal, so whatever you pick, you're not gonna make a mistake. All right, that's it. You've successfully migrated your app from Next.js to whatever framework you picked. Let me know in the comments what you picked, and I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye!